Alright, welcome back to another CSS Grid video where I teach you the basics of CSS Grid Layout, the new CSS3 specification. Alright, in this video we're going to talk about what are called grid areas. Now grid areas, as you can see, they're kind of templated spots that are designated on your grid for placing content. So you can designate an entire section of the grid with the grid area to be for a particular purpose. You can name those things, and you can also determine where they start and where they end. So I'm going to show you just kind of the basics of grid areas. This is a little bit more advanced, so if you haven't gotten a handle on the basics of the grid template, columns and rows, and some of the things that are available to you in the more basic parts of CSS Grid, I suggest you go back in this playlist. Just go to the top and start watching from there. Let's cover what we have here so far. I have set up a grid wrapper, and then I have 6 child elements that are grid elements. They're called grid items. I have one marked header, one marked sidebar. I have this div here that's got an article inside of it. I have another sidebar. I have a widgets kind of area, and then I have a footer. Excuse me, and that's all the markup that we need. I'll show you this. It's just an H1 article title, and then it's got a P tag inside of it, and that's, it's just a typical article title with paragraph text. So we'll just close that up for simplicity's sake. I've taken away the margin on all of the P elements. Could have done the same thing for the body. When I use CodePen, it adds a little bit of a padding on the body, so I usually like to take that away. Alright, so we have our grid wrapper set up, and right now it's set to display grid. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 evenly spaced columns. That's why everything is evenly spaced across here. So if I were to do this, they would all grow and shrink evenly. And then I have the grid template rows set to auto, so when they flow down, they're just going to be automatically, this is not a rigid grid, they're just going to flow down automatically. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do is that we need to declare. You can do this in any order that you want to. I like to declare what I want the grid areas to be first, and then I like to go back into these settings and then set up the actual grid. So if we go to each of our elements, our first element is here. It's got a header in it, so that's obviously what we want to do with that. And what we're normally going to want to do with the header is to send it all the way across, right? So what we're going to do is set up grid wrapper and int child 1, which gives us other grid items. I'm sorry, not grid wrapper, grid item. And then int child 1 gives us this very first one. Okay, so this is a bit of an advanced CSS property, but I don't want to have to go through and name these grid item 1, grid item 2, grid item 3. So if you want to save a little bit on your CSS, learn how to use the int child selectors, especially in lists. So let's go ahead and do grid item int child 1, and that's going to be for our header up here. And we're just going to call that grid area header. It's really as easy as that. So notice when you do that it pulls everything out of the flow of the document. That's not going to be a problem in just a minute, because we're going to set everything into specific places on the document. So int child 2 is going to be a sidebar. Three is going to be what we call the main. You could call this whatever, I'm just calling it main, so that stands for the main content. 4 would be sidebar 2. So So we have 2 sidebars in this layout. 5 is going to be what I call a widgets area. And then the last area is the footer. So we'll just call it footer. Okay. So now we have all of our grid areas defined. And now we come back up into where we've set the display grid, and we're talking about our overall grid properties here. And we're going to say grid, template, areas, and then if you're just using regular CSS, you can just go down and create another space. If you look back on the if you look back over here, you can see how they've laid it out at CSS-Tricks. This is actually one of the interesting things about grid layout, is that when you're defining these template areas, in some ways when you're defining the columns as well, when you look at the code, you can visually see what the grid is going to look like. So there's going to be a header is going to take up 4 spaces all the way across, which is all 4 columns, and then you're going to have a main section in 2. Then there's going to be a space, and then there's going to be a sidebar over here, and then you're going to have a footer that goes all the way across the bottom. So even in the way that you can write this in the CSS, you can actually see how the grid is going to be laid out, which is really cool because it gives you kind of a visual reference, and it honestly helps you to deal with the layout of the grid. So a lot of thought went into that. So what we want to do is, just like here, we want our header to go all the way across, and so the number of times that we write the word header is how many columns it's going to take up. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So let's just do header. Now I'm just going to copy and paste this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now our header element goes all the way across. It's not going to show up until I give it a semicolon. Remember, this is just a property. Even though we're writing it like this, it's just a property like any other property. And let's give it a background of red, and we should be able to see that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we go down to the second row, and on the second row we want sidebar, and we also want sidebar. Actually, the second row, since we're doing a mobile style first, let's just set it like this, and we'll just do the main. So main, one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we'll give our main a background color as well. Oh. You'll notice what I'm doing is I'm putting these out of order, right? Do you see that? So the first child is the header, but the article, the main section, is actually the third child. But through grid, you can actually put that and lay it out as you want. Now, one of the philosophies of laying out a mobile layout is to put the most important content at the top and then move down. Normally, a website's just going to take this HTML and it's just going to lay it out. You're going to get header, then sidebar, then article, then sidebar, then widgets, and then footer. Now we could lay out this grid or this HTML layout to be exactly what we want in the mobile first, and that's probably advisable to go ahead and do that. So let's just go ahead and do it right here, and we'll make this the second child. And then the third child is going to be this one, the sidebar. So let's swap these. So this one's going to be 3, and this one's going to be 2. And so now, even when all of this grid layout stuff is turned off, you're going to get a header first, then you're going to get the article, And then the next part is going to be the first sidebar, the second sidebar, and the widgets, and then the footer. So that's how it's going to be laid out if there were no CSS applied to the page at all. And the importance of that is how it's being read both by screen readers for accessibility, and also how it's being crawled by, what are they called? Search engines like Google or Yahoo or Bing. So they're going to start prioritizing content from the top all the way down to the bottom. So the things at the top are the most important, the things at the bottom typically are the least important. So you need to write your HTML in that way, and I just goofed up when I was writing it, because I was thinking about design first more than I was thinking about the HTML. But the beauty of some of the new CSS properties is we can now take this third item and we can move it kind of anywhere we want to, so that in the HTML it renders in a hierarchical way, but when someone looks at it visually, then we're able to kind of adjust it around, and we can create a visual hierarchy that's different than the HTML hierarchy, which is very freeing for the designer. Okay, so the second row is going to be all the main. The third row is going to be all of the sidebar. So again, let's just copy that 6 times. So we have the sidebar, and you can see the sidebar down there. Let's get that a background of pink. So you can see it's pink now. The next row is going to be the sidebar 2. Okay, so we have sidebar 2 here. Let's give sidebar 2 a color as well. It's going to be yellow. And the next row that we have is going to be the widgets. So 2, 4, 6. And then the widgets are going to be a background of orange. And then the last one is going to be the footer. Okay. So 2, 4, 6 of the footer. And let's go ahead and give the footer a background color as well. And we'll just give that one like a gray color. Okay. So now we have our page laid out, and this is how we would normally do it for a mobile device. We would make all these things collapse down into single column. So it's essentially just doing the flow of our HTML. If you just wanted to not start the grid, this is how. So we've taken off the grid styling and we kept the colors, but essentially everything is the same, right? So this is the flow of the HTML here, and then all of these things are just stacked on top of one another. I want to give these things a little bit of definition, so what I'm going to do is, I said that because you could actually start the grid wrapper. You could give it a media query where it doesn't start, the grid doesn't start kicking in until you actually get to the size that you want to get to. This might be a wise thing to do at this point because grid is not as supported on mobile browsers as it is on the desktop. So once you get to kind of desktop sizes, you could do some different things with it. But for mobile devices, it might be better at this point to go ahead and not set up the grid until you get to a media query breakpoint that's more of a desktop size. So that's just a little tip. I've been doing that in the past, and it's just something you can do or not do. So I'm going to say height is just 10 viewport height. 10 viewport height is the same So this is equal to 10%. Oh. So that's the same thing as saying 10%. So it's 10 height units. There are 100 height units from the top of the viewport to the bottom, and then I'm taking up 10, so essentially 10%. You could also use percentages as well, but when you use viewport height and viewport width, sometimes things react a little bit differently. For the sidebar, we're going to say the sidebar 1 is going to be 30, and we're going to say the main is going to have no, I don't want any sort of restrictions on the height here. I want it to just flow with the content, and then I'm just going to put a little padding on here, and then it'll give a little bit of padding there. You can also see it short up this because we're getting some margin from this H1 tag here. That's why we're getting this weird space. So when I give a little padding to that, it's going to short up and put it right together with the header. Sidebar 2, let's say a height of 20. So a little bit smaller than sidebar 1. The widgets still a little smaller at 10. And then the footer, just a little slim footer. So 5. Okay, so we give a little bit of definition to our page here, so you can see these areas are clearly different, right? So let's go ahead and get back into our grid system here, but right now it's all being laid out as if it were just being rendered as plain HTML, which it's being rendered right now. So let's turn this back on. I don't mind having this turned on even for mobile devices. I think the compatibility with mobile is going to be better and better as we get along, and so I'm not very scared of that. Let's put this up here. And then what we want to do is, let's say at 500 we'll set our first breakpoint. So the article is starting to get a little wide, and maybe we're going to have enough space to be putting a sidebar here. So we want this sidebar, the pink one, to go on the left side. So the way that we do that is that we would just copy you just change the grid, literally just change the grid. So we're going to create a media query. If you don't know about media queries, they're one of the baselines of responsive web design, so you need to get short up on that. Great places to go to learn about media queries are the Mozilla Developer Network or the w3schools.com. If you go and we do media query, we're going to say minimum width, so we're going up. So as you go from small to large, then we're going to hit this. So the minimum width for this to happen is going to be 500. We're just going to say 500 pixels. You could use M's or any sort of unit that you want to use there. And then we create our outside bracket. So this is a place that we have in order to nest our code. And then we're just going to drop that code that we what do we do? We copied it. And so we're just going to drop that in there. Now we don't need to define the grid again. Again, if you were just starting, if you had none of this and you were defining the grid once you get to a certain breakpoint, but letting HTML do the rest before that, then you would make sure that you were defining the grid here. So what I'm talking about is if this did not exist, then you would define the grid at 500, right? If you just had this flowing as the HTML. That is not our case. We have that, and let's go and redo that, and we'll take off. We don't need grid. We also don't need, because it's set to auto, we don't need that. And really the only thing we're changing are the grid template columns and the grid template areas. On this one, this breakpoint, we're not going to change that. We're just going to change the areas. So what we want is to keep our header going all the way across in the first row. Now in the second row, we don't want the main to take up everything. We actually want the sidebar to take up two columns. And then we can remove that sidebar here, and then what we're left with is once we get to, we're at 300, once we get to 500, it's going to pop up pan, right? So at our media query, we're at 505, so it pops up, and now it begins to take up one FR and one FR. Now if you wanted to set a width for this sidebar, then you could do that as well just by doing this. You could say, you could bring that down, and let's say we want our sidebar to be 200 pixels wide, so you would say 100 pixels and 100 pixels, and then now you can watch the sidebar. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, there it goes. And now the sidebar, see this area here is really flexible, but the sidebar is not moving. The sidebar is a static element. You see that? But when you come down here, the sidebar is a flexible unit. Okay. So you can see that the sidebar is not, it's growing. It's not a standard unit that's just sitting there. Again, you can use any sort of values you want here in terms of units. I'm just using pixels for simplicity's sake, but it hasn't changed this. It hasn't changed any of the other parts of the grid, but you have a static sidebar there. I don't really like that. I like everything to be a little bit more flexible. So I'm just going to set it back to the way it was. And then now you can see, you see how the word sidebar is moving? That means it's taking up 2 fraction units, and then this is taking up the remaining 4 fraction units. Okay, so very interesting. You could stop right there and you could have your layout just like this. I don't like this here, and what's happening is it's remembering the 30 viewport height. So this is always going to be at 30% from here to the bottom. So what we can do is we can set a media query here at 500 pixels, and what we're going to do is we're just going to say, let's just grab it, and then the only thing that we really need to change is the height, and we're just going to say auto on that. That way it takes up however much space is available to it. Okay, so it takes up the entire space. So however long this is going to take up the same amount of space, whatever the longest part of this row is. Okay. There are lots of other things you could do with that whenever you set widths and heights and things like that, and then something is taking up more space, so it's sitting in a column that has more space than what it means, and you can move it around that column as well and do some different things by using align self or justify self. Those are elements or properties that we talked about in previous videos, so if you don't know about aligning things on the grid, then I suggest you go back and you watch those videos as well. Okay, so this is good. It starts to get to where maybe, let's say, I don't know, 800 pixels. I think that's going to be enough space where we can add in the second sidebar. So again, what we have to do is come up here and we'll just set another media query. So let's just go ahead and copy this, and then we'll set another media query at 800 pixels. And then this time what we want to do is we want to have 2 sidebars. So we're going to put in here sidebar 2, sidebar 2, and then we can get rid of this row of sidebars. Okay, so we can take that out. So now we have our header all the way across. We have one sidebar that takes up 2 columns. We have our main content that takes up 2 columns, and then we have sidebar 2, which is also going to take up 2 columns on this side. We have a full row for our widgets, and we have a full row for our footer. So let's go ahead and look at that and see what that looks like. So we're getting up close to 800 and bam. Okay, so we pop and now we have our sidebar 2. Again, we're running into the same issue we ran in with the first sidebar, which is that we need a media query to set that height to auto. So let's just come down here, and this is actually going to be at 800. We want to set the number 4. So this is child 4, and we set it to auto. And we don't do that until we get to 800, because if we did it at 500, then you would see it shrink up. It wouldn't keep this size here. It would just shrink up, and it would be about that size. So whatever size your content is, that's what it would be. But when it pops, now we have a nice full length sidebar. Now everything here is all the same size. So remember, we have the all of our columns are 1 fraction unit. So this is 2 columns, this is 2 columns, and this is 2 columns. They're all taking up the same amount of space. But what we want is for the sidebar to be a little slim and for this to take up the main part of the page. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our grid wrapper and we need to change these elements right here. In fact, we could take this one off, because this one is the same as this. We haven't made those changes, but here we are going to change the column structure. So I do want these to take up 1 fraction unit over 2 columns, but in the middle section I want it to take up, let's say, 200 pixels and 200 pixels. So remember, the middle 2 columns, that's our main section, and then we're going to have these are flexible fraction units. So when we get there, you can see that these 2 things are very flexible, but this area here is not flexible at all. Okay. You could also do the opposite. So you could do, if you didn't want the sidebars to be flexible, but you want the main content area to be flexible, then all you have to do is make the main content area fraction units, and then make your columns to be very non-flexible units. So you see that? So now these 2 units are not flexible at all. They're staying a specific width, and then this is taking up all of the rest of the width. So that might be something that you're going for. That way you have kind of more of a responsive area in here. But if you want to control this area, then you just create that area to be the fixed unit here in the middle 2 columns. So you can see there's a lot of flexibility here with this. You could also make this sidebar, because it's different, you can make it a different size, so it's a little bit smaller. So you can see this might be your main navigation, and this might be just some extra space over here to use for advertising or whatever you want to do. But that's kind of a secondary sidebar, and you can create that visual hierarchy this way. Okay. So now we have our 3-column layout. It hits at 800 pixels wide, so just past, let's say on a tablet it would be 2 columns. So a tablet is about here. So on a tablet, this is what it would look like. You would have a sidebar down here and some widgets and a footer. And then once you get to 1024 is like an iPad on its side. So once you get to this point here, you would have 2 columns with your widgets and your footer. And then everything up above this would be different. So you could even set media queries to have the entire grid take up only this intersection, or you could have this section here taking up only so many spaces. So there's a lot of flexibility with grid. And then from this, you could go inside and you can see how we created a superstructure for the website. So the entire website is a grid, And then you can go inside of each of these areas, and then you can begin to build content inside of these areas. Or you could put in PHP tags, and then you could flow content into it. But this is essentially setting up a grid superstructure, which is essentially what grid was made for, is to set up the larger structure of your entire website. And then you can begin to put you can nest other grids inside of these cells. You can put your content, you can put dynamic content, whatever you want, but you've created different grid areas for everything to go into. So it's really interesting and amazing part of Grid, and so we've created a responsive grid layout using the grid areas. To learn more about grid areas, I encourage you to go to CSS-Tricks, and they have a complete guide to grid. Also, there's a great website that's called Grid by Example, and this is actually created by some of the people who have been working with the grid specification from the beginning. And so there's tons of examples, lots of videos. It's called gridbyexample.com, and that site is actually being improved and made better every day. And so those are really good resources that I continue to go back to in order to continue to learn the finer points of grid. Excuse me. And if you have any questions about grid, or you have any questions about what you've seen in the video, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can. Also, if you can also send me a tweet on Twitter at Brian Hafferkamp. And again, just continue to look at resources, continue to build things. Look in the show notes, and I have some links to both this particular pen, and I have links to some other grid resources that I've done. Watch the other videos in this playlist, and I think you'll begin to get a handle on what grid can do and what it can do for your particular style or brand of web design. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.